No?
I stopped when there was a tiger a couple seasons
Oh, the
ago.
tiger's the best, man.
Yeah.
All about the tiger. No, my wife hates the tiger too. She's like, that's the dumbest thing ever. Sheba. All right, so let's try the. What's that? It's not a zombie tiger. It's a rescue from a zoo that's been trained to eat people's throats, which is what all tigers ought to do.
Is this season 7?
8.
No, season 7 with the Tigers. I'm on season 7. I haven't seen no Tiger season 6. So.
No, the tiger comes out in season 7. Yeah, when you meet the king. You met the king yet? Ooh, Ezekiel's awesome. Hey, there we go. So now the post works. So whatever Morgan I had wrong there was the problem. So I've posted what looks like a team, right? Because the post route gave me back my team, right? Team res send team. I see a team. I should be able to go to my database now and do teams find and see a team in the database. So I can see there's actually a team in the database, which is awesome sauce, right? So next thing I want to do is delete the team, right? See if I can do that. So what's the steps to delete a team? Well, let's cache the ID. What's that? That ID, right? So it's just so I don't have to deal with that deep object anymore, right? So what else do we want to do then?
So, yeah,
There you go. Team.remove. And what do I want to remove?
team ID.
I got to say ID is team ID. Okay. So you remember in Mongo, all these commands take an object, right? So I can identify something by ID. I can use by name. I can do, if you don't use ID, things are kind of slow with bigger data sets, but this is sort of your key into the system. So team.remove ID, and we'll do a then, and we'll do a catch next. Do you like that catch next? Or like the longer format better? Just do catch next. It's the same thing.
What we've been doing before was also putting like error messages and stuff in that document.
You can, right? We don't know what the error message is here, right? I could say, catch status code, 562, message. I have no idea what's wrong, right? So that's not very helpful, right? But it's also more helpful than having a vomit of error log too, right? Probably shouldn't do that. All right, so once I've removed it, I'm going to do what? I'm just going to do something simple like a res.send bye-bye team.
Is there any way, to specify what team that is, or that team's already?
The team is gone at this point. I could do a lookup first, right? I could do a find on the team, then delete the team, and then I can say bye-bye team with the name as a more friendly error message. So we can actually leave a note in here to do that. Say, to do, look up the team first so that we can include its name in the response, right? That's a good fixer for later, right? So let's go take a look at and see if we can delete this team. So we'll copy the team ID out of here, and I'll go back to my command line, and we'll do delete team, singular team, right? Team ID. Bye-bye team. If I go back to the database now and look up that team, teams.find, I should have nothing in there, and I don't, right? So well done, you've deleted a team. So I think it'd be interesting now to actually see if we can find that team for real. Let's put it back in there. So do the post of the team, and let's just do another. Let's just do 2 teams, just so we have 14U black. actual team names. Okay. Okay, so to fetch a single team, what do you think we need to be doing here? Very similar to what we have for delete, correct?
Yeah, you get
Pretty much going to grab the ID, right? So I'm just going to do what good coders do and take my awesome work and use it again and again and again. Let my team ID equal whatever, right? I don't want to remove it, right? I want to do what? Find one, right? With the ID of team ID.
just a regular find work as well if
Yeah.
you use an ID.
Yep. And there's also find by ID. There's many methods to do this. Find one is just fat fingers or muscle memory, right? But yeah, find by ID. I think different versions of Mongoose don't have find by ID yet. I think it's like more of a later thing. But when I find the team, right, now my then is going to get the team. And we're going to do the res send team. And we're going to catch next. Look good? Let's give her a test. So if I do go back to the database, this is kind of annoying to go back to the database every time, isn't it? We're going to want to get that list model working, the list route working. So I'll copy a team. Let's copy the black team out, their ID, and I'll do get team blah, and there's the black team. So our get route works just fine for one team. And then finally we'll do the get teams. And that should be relatively the same thing, right? What's the wrinkle in get teams?
What do you mean? Pass it in the object.
So what I could do is this. I could simply say this. Team find all of them,
Okay.
right? And then teams, right? I could do that. You could also allow this to be more flexible and do queries for actual query objects, right? Let somebody type in let teams ampersand name equals this, so and so equals that, and you can make this a little more complex. So a good to-do item here. Support, we'll just say support, I'm going to say random. Not just a vomit of all teams, right? That's a great way to improve this. But this ought to work. This ought to give us just the list of all the teams. So if I head back to the command line, and now I do get teams, I get them both. And if I delete the cardinal team, where's my delete? And I get the teams, I'm left with just the black team. So we got a fully functional RESTful API for the teams. Cool? Yeah.
What do you mean by random query? I thought the whole reason was to find to get them all.
Sure, I might want to do teams name equals 14U. Something like that, right? So I can actually push query parameters in and do some more intricate searching. Beyond the scope of this, we're just going to get a list and one at this point, but you could certainly implement Google if you wanted to, right? You'll see that just gets ignored, okay? All right, so the team route is amazing. I'd like to do the same thing for the player route. I think we need to just kind of type all that again or kind of just copy and paste it in there to save time.
Yeah, copy.
Let's just do it, right? There you go. Unfortunately, I scaffolded it all before, so we're going to have to do some copy and paste again. All right, so we're going to say teams to players, say team router to player router, and we're going to say team to player. All right, Let's see how well that did. So player equals require, models players, post to players, new player equals player. Let's send, I'm going to make this a lowercase p. Okay, let's go ahead and make a player and check that all of our routes work. So we'll just go ahead and do all the same tests that we just did. Post to players. Oops. Echo. What's in our player model? Name,
Bats.
John,
Throws.
that's right, throws, right,
Position.
yep, position,
The last segmentation around the second hour.
Yeah. Throws.
position catcher, pipe that to players, post not found. Oh, yeah. Hey, look at that. We made him. Let's go and make Fred while we're at it. Actually, make my son Zach. That's left. Throws. Whoops. Throws right. Space. And if we go to the Mongo, we should be able to do dv.players. And John and Zach are in there. So let me go ahead and delete me, since I don't really play. Bye-bye player. And let's see if it actually deleted me. And we're left with just Zach in the database, which is cool. And I can also do the search from the route itself. So if I try and get that player, I get nothing. If I get all the players, whoops, I get just Zach. So I can delete, I can post, I can get one, I can get all. Right? So our routes are rocking right now, which is really cool. Any questions to this point? Okay, this should be exactly where we left off from Tyler's last session, correct? Able to create one of these, not both, but one of them, right? Have it save, read, update, all that kind of stuff, right? So I think we're kind of level set. Questions about the approach I took to making this different from what you have done in lab so far and from what Tyler has shown you so far? Did we diverge too much from what you've been taught?
No, the only thing that was different was setting up the server.
Just the process I took to do it? Yeah, that's just a personal way I do things. And it's almost like we talk about the interviews, right? So I told you at the start when we interview you, I like you to repeat back the requirements, list what you're going to do, write your pseudocode, fill in your code. That's the approach I took here. Same exact thing, right? I kind of set everything up with empty methods all over the place and started filling them in as I needed, right? If I was doing real TDD, I would have set up all that stuff, and then what you do is you write your tests, and your tests can assert on all the methods, and the methods are there, and they just return nothing. They just don't do anything. But you're not failing tests because methods haven't been written yet. You're failing tests because they don't do anything yet. So for me, it's just a way to kind of get a good, step back, 10,000-foot view of the app, make sure that everything is wired the way I expect it to be, and now I start filling in the details, right? So at this point, honestly, the server is not interesting anymore. I'm just going to close that file down. And the team route and the player routes are also not interesting because they work. But we're not going to go back to those things again. So let's just go and delete those just to kind of get them out of our way. as we're coding here. This is the one, right? And the error file, we don't need that. So let's take a look at the team file. Now, this is where the cool stuff happens, okay? So Mongoose also, this is to Robbie's earlier question, why Mongoose? Mongoose gives us a lot of cool stuff built in. And it's got its own form of middleware. And it does things called pre and post hooks that we're going to use today to kind of help us out. These are almost like event listeners, as you have used in the front end, okay? And very much like we did, remember the chat server where we did, on data, the event listener? So this is the same thing here. So what we're going to do is say, and let's actually do this one first, since we're going to post it. So here's a little hook that says, before we save a team, let's make sure it has a valid roster. Okay, so and I'm in the schema file for team. Okay, and you see that I pulled in the roster. Okay, pre-save. So before I save this record, I'm going to do some things. The first thing I'm going to do is take some notes inside my code here. Right, we're going to see if this team has a roster. Okay, and if not, what should I be doing if I don't have a roster? Create one, right? If it does, yay, right? Does that make sense? If it has a roster, we're good. If it doesn't have a roster, I got to create one. And what? I want to point to it. Right? I got to create a roster, get its ID. Right? Create one, get its ID, and point to it. Okay. The reason why we're doing this before we save is we say, so at this point, team will look something like this. Team will look like name 14U black. Like that's what the team model looks like now. What I want this thing to end up with is something like this. Name 14U black, roster, blah 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 blah, right? That's what it needs to look like before we save it. So what we do is we get this logic here should create that at the end. And then it will go through and save when it's all done.
The term save in quotations is referring to the save method that schemas have.
Yep. Yeah. So basically, when we're in the team route, which I've closed because it wasn't interesting, well, not got interesting again. When we call this save method right here, before this actually runs, it's going to go. Now, you notice I created a new team already. So I've got the object that it's about to try and save. So I've got all the information that I need to do any kind of a lookup that I want to do. Exactly. So now we're going to go ahead and use this little handler here. Nope, there's the secret. So let's take a look at how we do that. So I've got the roster pulled in. And what I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and just leave that there for reference. We're going to do roster.find1. This dot roster. Okay, so what that will do is basically what? So this dot roster should be an ID, right? So if I have one, so we're going to say then, let's just say roster. We get something back, right? If find one succeeds, we're going to have a roster. And I got to do some logic in here. I've got to basically say if roster.id. So the underscore ID is, what's that?
That's from Mongo.
It's from Mongo, right? I'm going to return it. Return roster. And that will bubble down into the next. Okay?
Can you scroll from the code a little bit so we can see the top part of the functions? Yeah. guess you know that much.
Yeah. Actually, I could probably get rid of this here, so it makes more sense.
I can't remember if it doesn't exist, wouldn't it just throw the error? Like, as long as you're in the then, wouldn't it always have an ID?
It won't throw an error because I don't have a roster yet. It's going to come back with nothing.
Okay.
Then the same as we did with the post for the team, new roster equal new roster empty object. So it's just going to create a pointer in the system.
Nothing was required in that roster.
What's that?
Nothing was required
Nope.
in that roster schema.
No, the roster schema. I'll pull it back up again. It just says list of players. That's all it's got, and of course the ID is implied, right? Let roster equal new roster, and I'm going to say new roster save. Oop. Just use data. Oh god, it makes my head hurt. Return data. Okay, makes sense for what's going on there.
What does lowercase roster equal?
Um,
21.
Oh, it's the return value. So find one roster using this roster. Okay, so I'm sending this roster, right, which should be, again, if the system is, if the team has a roster, the object looks like this. So this first line here, roster find one, this roster should be this jiggly flats, right? So it'll send that in. If it finds the roster in the database, I'll get that roster as the value, right? So the then will receive the roster that it found in the database. That make sense? It's the same thing as our route, right? If you look at your, well now again, the uninteresting route, back to life. If I'm getting teams, getting a team find one by ID, then I get the team.
Can you prove to me real quick that if
We'll go to else.
that if it doesn't exist, you
Mm-hmm.
don't just go ahead and like in there?
Sure, we can, hang on a second. Do that right. Then roster if here, let me clear this error out first. And data. What's jacked up there? Yeah. Data. Shouldn't need to do this, but
It gets that
so in
far
here you want to
level.
say what's in here.
Yeah.
So then roster console.log roster, like so. Just see what we get.
So it'll be empty if there's
Mhm.
nothing there, or it'll be.
Right.
Okay.
That's why it'll go
I
to.
certainly won't have roster.id, right? So, okay, so let's go ahead and see. I think we're not quite wired up completely here, but let's just see what happens when I run it. There it goes. Nope, where's my... host? Okay, so it's gonna bomb. So I get a null. Okay, which is what I would expect to get back. Control escape. And that's why this bit up here works. So if I don't, when roster is null, there is no ID. It'll fall into here. It'll make a new one.
But are you getting an error? Like if you just had a catch statement, wouldn't that just
I'm not doing anything with the error though. I mean, it's not. There's no error. It actually returns me null.
why you're okay? So But didn't you have an unpromised or uncommon promise error?
Did I?
Yeah. So
That's
you
well.
had a
I'm not through this whole thing yet, right? I'm
Okay,
still. Yeah, we're still wiring up the bits.
Okay, but okay.
Yep. Whoops. Is that nasty to do that? Probably is. Okay, what's happening here? Let's go to it. Else. That's right. This roster ID.
I think you should still return it.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't need to do. I just need to return. Right?
You don't need to get any bracelets.
Oh, I don't need your. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Okay, I think that's right. Let's double check. Let's go back to. Ooh, awesome. Roster find one. Okay, so that got an error there. Let's go ahead and look here real quick and see. That's the same thing. Ah, there's my problem. A little bit of bad logic in there. I knew I was going down a rabbit hole. If I don't have the roster, let's do that first. If I don't have the roster, then return. That's right. And roster. Yep. Cool. Okay, so logic here, again, I'm sorry I had to go back and forth there for a minute, but so find by ID, get back a roster. If I have an ID, I just return the roster that I got because it will have an ID on it. Otherwise, I make a new one and I return that. So in this next then, this roster will have an ID. And I'm assigning my roster, this guy down here, to that ID. Does that connection make sense?
Can we go back through from, alright, so from line
Sure.
20,
So we're going to find by ID this roster. And again, at this point, we look like this. The object is this right now, has no roster, right? So this is going to return null, as we saw, okay? So this is now null. If roster.id, I don't have that, so I'm going to be in this else. And then I'm going to say, well, let new roster equals new roster with an empty object, and return new roster.save. That will return me a roster when it saves. It'll return me the object just like it does for a post, okay? Now I've got a roster. And the roster object will look at this point like It'll just be ID, you know, blah 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 blah, and players like that. That's what the roster object will look like here. Because remember, the roster model just has players in it. So this should be an empty array of players at this point, right here. Then what I'm going to do then is say this roster, for this object here, for this 14U black name, this roster is going to be that roster's ID. So now I'm going to set this roster to be whatever I got. This actually should be like the same thing, right? That'll be that when it's all done.
Because in our team model, we have roster underscore
In the team model,
we're just inserting that right now.
so the team model just has a roster node. That's all. Just a roster thing, and it expects an ID. That's all. Only thing it knows about today at this point. I have a roster. I expect an ID to be in there. When this team saves, again, we're going to try and find a roster that matches it. So, for example, let's say we saved it and it was fine. And I came back and I saved it again, right? It would look like this coming in. I'll copy it and put it up here. This time through, it says find by ID this dot roster, find by ID this, and it says, ooh, I have one.
That's true.
Right, it's true. I just return the roster back, right? And that jumps down to this first then. And in this first then, roster, I expect it to be an object with an ID field. So I either return the roster I found or the roster I created. In both cases, they had the same shape. It's an ID with a player thing on it, right? All I care about is the ID. And I'm going to assign my roster to that roster's ID. And I should end up with this down here. Does that make sense as we go through it? Okay.
Line 30 needed.
This done callback gets called automatically. It's like next almost. That's the way that the Mongo middleware works, or Mongoose middleware works. So you have to call it. And catch, we just kind of pass it through, right? If it's an error in there, it'll just run through. So this ought to now work. Excuse me. I don't know why this thing is stuck at the bottom of my screen, but anyway. Yeah, another error. Memory property ID of null
You're still looking for an ID on that
on line 23.
when you're not getting anything back.
Right.
Is that how you?
Say if
Yeah. So,
you see roster equals null, then do that.
yeah, I have to say, what I really need to do is say if, I got to reverse the logic here. That's a good catch. So I'm going to say
You need to do a type off.
if not roster. Makes sense? That'll clear us out of that mess. So if I don't have a roster, if I'm within that null condition, create it and go, otherwise I return what I got. Now this should be okay. Oops. Sorry about the jumping around with the console and the editor. So there we go. So now I've got, when I posted my team, I got back, you'll notice this time the roster ID. Okay, so if I go to Mongo directly and I go db.teams.find, you'll see black doesn't have a roster, but purple does have a roster. And if I go to db.rosters.find, there's that one. Okay, that's players. Oh, wait. 59, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Yep, it's the same number. So, does that connection make sense, how it happened? Right? It's a little bit of work to get that done, but once you've got it done, now I'm always tied together. So now I make a team, I have a roster every single time. Now, what I want to do is do something a little bit more interesting with that. Let's go back to our code. And I'll leave the notes in here so that you guys can remember what we talked about. But let's do this for fun. I'm going to do a little bit of pre-func on find one. Okay, so team schema pre, find one. So you'll see that in our team route when I query for one. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Teams.js. When I'm getting one, right, I just spit the team back out. Okay. Now, if I go ahead and do this, will probably do nothing right here. Let's just make sure. Escape. I don't know why this thing is minimized every time. So my team is that one. I get the roster, just the raw data for it. What I really want is the roster. Wouldn't it be cool if I could search for this team and get the roster and all the players in it at one shot? Right? That's what we're going to do now. So we're going to go ahead and tie those two pieces together. Here. So I'm going to uncomment this little bit of magic. And actually, let's do, oops. I'm going to do it in two stages here. This populate roster. So populate understands that I've got a reference to rosters. Okay? So when I populate rosters, this is why singular plural makes a difference, right? It's going to find that field. Actually, I need to do this roster. It's going to populate the roster field based on this reference. So it's going to populate this field with this reference. So now when I go ahead and query, I should get the roster field populated. And again, all the magic. Bam. So now I have a roster that's exploded. And I've got the player. It's not just the ID, it's the roster itself, full object. And if I had players in the roster, they would also be listed here. Does that make sense? Right? It's kind of like a homemade little join right there. Right? So populate is kind of the key player here, right? So we've been here for 2 hours to teach you one word, which is populate, right? But again, you got to go through all that stuff to kind of get there. And that's an important piece of it, right? Knowing that you have two tables that depend on each other, right? Or in this case, it's a one-way connection, right? Team has a roster, right? And by the ID of the roster, and using this reference that points to the rosters table, Mongoose can be told to populate that field, okay? As we start adding players to the system, then I can do more tie-ins. I can say, hey, tie the roster to the team, and while you're at it, tie all the players to the roster. So now when we come back from break, we'll go ahead and make the players do the same thing. We'll say add a player and say add them to a team, add them to a roster, and even more magic will happen. So let's break back at 8:45.
Do you need to do the pre-save stuff to populate, or can you just populate just at the start?
If you don't populate, so if I don't do this, I don't get the reference. Right? So if I look at the raw data in Mongo,
The express.router is actually.
So in Mongoose, it didn't make it seem as though you needed to do the first part you did, the pre-save. It just
if I don't pre-save it, right? So pre-saving, let me clear some space here. So teams and rosters. So if I don't pre-save it, I can't get this right here. That won't save into the, that won't save.
it won't let you populate.
Exactly. Populate basically ties this right here to this right here on the model.
And then you're gonna later
No,
on,
yours weren't local.
we're gonna be able to fit, like pick a wizard and just fill that, and it'll fill the whole.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got, like I said, we've got the the team with an empty roster. The next step is to say players add to a team, and it's going to automatically go ahead and add to the roster for that team.
Okay.
That's the next piece.
So I have mine have films and I have wizards.
Yep.
So I'm going to connect a wizard to a film, and then obviously I do the way that you did by creating an empty wizard with the ID and a name.
Right.
And then when I'm creating it, I just need to then go in later on to that film when I create a wizard and then associate it to a film. That's what I have to do. If I wanted to go in.
Yeah. So when you create a wizard, you have to kind of like I'm doing with the players here, right? So what the player logic will be is post a player to a team, go to the team, look for the roster that it has, apply that roster to the player, add the player to the roster. So you're doing all this moving data around to make that work. Your wizard will be probably the same basic thing.
Okay. Seems like
It's a lot of jumping around.
I know at the end it probably seems lovely, but just